The blood on her apron had barely dried when Martha Zimmerman heard the news that would shatter what remained of her fragile world. Her husband was dead, shot down in a senseless saloon dispute over a card game he hadn't even been playing in. She stood in the doorway of their small house on the outskirts of North Platte, Nebraska, watching Sheriff Morton deliver the news with his hat clutched apologetically in weathered hands, and felt the last thread of hope she'd been clinging to simply snap. It was April of 1878, and at 24 years old, Martha found herself widowed, childless, and utterly alone in a world that had never been kind to women without protection. The funeral was a sparse affair. Thomas Zimmerman had been a quiet man, a shopkeeper with few friends and fewer enemies, which made his death all the more tragically pointless. He'd been in the wrong place at the wrong moment when bullets started flying at the Red Dust Saloon, and now Martha stood beside a simple pine coffin, listening to Reverend Price drone on about God's mysterious ways while the prairie wind whipped at her black mourning dress. She didn't cry. The tears had dried up somewhere between hearing the news and watching them lower Thomas into the hard Nebraska soil. What she felt instead was a hollow emptiness that seemed to echo through her entire body. Thomas hadn't been a passionate love match, but he'd been steady and kind, and he'd promised her children. That promise now lay buried 6 feet under the unforgiving earth. The women of North Platte offered their condolences with tight smiles and suspicious eyes. Martha knew what they were thinking. A widow without children was a woman without purpose, someone to be pitied and quietly avoided. Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile pressed a handkerchief into her palm and murmured something about God's plan. Mrs. Walsh, the banker's wife, suggested Martha might consider returning to her family back east. Martha nodded politely to all of them, knowing she had no family to return to and no prospects for the future. What no one knew, what Martha had never told anyone except Thomas, was that she couldn't have children. A childhood illness had left her barren, or so the old doctor in St. Louis had told her mother when Martha was just 14. The words had been clinical and final: damaged, unable to conceive, unlikely to ever carry a child to term. Thomas had known when he married her, had told her it didn't matter, that they would make a life together regardless. But Martha had seen the disappointment in his eyes every time they passed a woman with a baby in her arms, had felt the weight of her failure every Sunday when families filled the church pews with their broods of children. Now, even that failure belonged to her alone. The weeks after the funeral blurred together in a haze of gray monotony. Martha took in sewing to pay the rent on the small house. Her fingers moved mechanically, stitching hems and mending tears in other people's clothing. While her mind wandered to dark places she tried not to examine too closely. The house felt impossibly large and suffocatingly small at the same time. Thomas's belongings still hung on their pegs by the door. His coffee cup still sat on the shelf. She couldn't bring herself to pack them away, but seeing them every day was like pressing on a fresh bruise. June arrived with scorching heat that baked the prairie grass brown and turned the dirt streets of North Platte into clouds of dust with every passing wagon. Martha was sitting on her front porch at dusk, trying to catch whatever breeze might stir in the evening air, when she heard the commotion down the street, shouting, the thunder of hooves, and then a woman's scream that cut through the still air like a knife. She stood up, shading her eyes against the dying sun, and saw a cluster of people gathering near the doctor's office. Her first instinct was to go inside, to close her door against whatever tragedy was unfolding. She'd had enough of tragedy. But something pulled her forward, perhaps simple human curiosity, perhaps the need to focus on someone else's pain instead of her own. By the time she reached the crowd, Dr. Pemberton was already emerging from his office, his face grim. Martha pushed through the onlookers and saw what had caused the commotion. A young woman lay in the back of a wagon, her dress soaked with blood, her face pale as death. Beside her, a man knelt with his hat pressed to his chest, his voice hoarse as he begged the doctor to help. "She's gone, doctor," Pemberton said quietly. "I'm sorry, son. She's been gone for a while now." The man's anguished cry made Martha's chest tighten. She started to turn away, unable to bear witness to such raw grief, when she heard another sound. A thin, reedy wail that seemed impossibly small and fragile. "The baby," someone in the crowd whispered. Martha's head snapped back around. Dr. Pemberton was reaching into the wagon, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, and then he was lifting something wrapped in a blood-soaked blanket. The The wail grew louder, more insistent. "It's a boy," the doctor announced. "Premature, but his lungs are strong." The man in the wagon didn't seem to hear. He was bent over the dead woman, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Martha recognized him now, though she'd never spoken to him. Quincy Xavier was his name, a cowboy who worked at the massive ranch operation north of town. She'd seen him in passing, had noticed him the way any woman might notice a handsome man, with his dark hair and startling blue eyes and the easy way he sat a horse. But she'd been married then, and he'd been courting the pretty blonde girl who worked at the hotel. Sarah, Martha remembered. The dead woman's name was Sarah. Dr. Pemberton was looking around helplessly, the squalling infant still in his arms. "The boy needs feeding. He needs a wet nurse or formula, and he needs it soon." "Quincy," the doctor said more loudly, trying to penetrate the man's grief. "Quincy, your son needs care." But Quincy Xavier didn't respond. He was lost in his mourning, oblivious to everything except the woman who would never wake up. Martha found herself stepping forward before her mind could catch up with her body. "I can help," she heard herself say. "Doctor," Pemberton turned to her with evident relief. "Mrs. Zimmerman, yes, that would be, could you take the boy? Just for tonight, until we can make proper arrangements." Martha's arms were reaching out before she could think better of it. The doctor placed the tiny bundle into her grasp, and suddenly she was holding a baby for the first time in her life. The weight was shocking, both heavier and lighter than she'd imagined. The baby's face was scrunched and red, his mouth open in protest at the violent way he'd entered the world. His eyes were squeezed shut, but his tiny fists waved in the air as if fighting off invisible demons. Something shifted in Martha's chest, a feeling so intense and unexpected that it nearly brought her to her knees. This was what she'd been denied, what she'd mourned for all these years. The weight of a child in her arms, the absolute dependence, the miraculous reality of new life. "I'll take care of him," she whispered, not sure if she was speaking to the doctor or the baby or the universe itself. She turned to go, but Dr. Pemberton caught her arm. "Just for tonight," he repeated. "The father will need to make decisions about the boy's future." Martha nodded, but she wasn't really listening. She was too focused on the baby in her arms, on the way his cries were already starting to soften as she instinctively began to rock him. She walked back to her house in a daze, barely aware of the stares from the remaining crowd, her entire world narrowed to the small being who needed her. Once inside, panic set in. She had no milk, no bottles, no clothes or diapers, or any of the things a baby required. She laid him carefully on her bed, surrounding him with pillows so he couldn't roll, and ran to her neighbor's house. Mrs. Patterson had 6 children. Surely she would have supplies. The older woman took one look at Martha's desperate face and sprang into action. Within minutes, she'd gathered clean cloths for diapers, a bottle and rubber nipple, and a tin of condensed milk. "Mix it with warm water," she instructed. "Not too thick, not too thin. Test it on your wrist to make sure it's not too hot." Martha rushed back home, her arms full of borrowed supplies. The baby was still crying, his face now purple with rage and hunger. Her hands shook as she tried to mix the formula according to Mrs. Patterson's instructions. It took 3 attempts before she got the temperature right, and by then, the baby's cries had reached a fever pitch that seemed impossible from such a small body. But the moment she got the nipple into his mouth, silence fell. He latched on with surprising strength, his tiny hands coming up to grip the bottle, his eyes finally opening to reveal a deep blue that reminded Martha of storm clouds over the prairie. She sank into her rocking chair, the same chair she'd sat in countless times while mending clothes, and watched in amazement as the baby drank. His eyes drooped as he ate, exhaustion overtaking hunger. By the time he'd finished half the bottle, he was asleep, milk dribbling from the corner of his mouth. Martha set the bottle aside and held him against her shoulder, patting his back gently the way she'd seen other women do. He let out a small burp that made her smile despite everything, and then he settled against her with a sigh that sounded almost content. She sat there for hours, long after darkness fell completely and the sounds of North Platte faded to silence. She couldn't bear to put him down. This moment, she knew, was stolen time. Come morning, Quincy Xavier would claim his son, would take him away to whatever future awaited a motherless boy with a grieving father. But for tonight, in the darkness of her small house, Martha could pretend. She must have dozed off in the chair because she woke with a start to the baby crying again. The room was still dark, but she could see the faintest hint of gray on the horizon. 3 in the morning, maybe 4. She changed his diaper with fumbling, inexperienced hands, cleaned him up, and made another bottle. This time the routine was a little easier, a little less terrifying. As dawn broke over North Platte, Martha finally laid the sleeping baby in a dresser drawer she'd lined with soft blankets, making an impromptu cradle. She stood over him, watching his chest rise and fall with each breath, memorizing every detail of his tiny face. She'd held a baby. She'd cared for him. She'd felt what it was like to be needed in this most fundamental way. It would have to be enough. The knock on her door came just after sunrise. Martha's heart sank as she went to answer it, knowing who it would be. But when she opened the door, she found not Quincy Xavier, but Dr. Pemberton, his medical bag in hand, and his expression troubled. "May I come in?" he asked. Martha stepped aside, and the doctor entered, glancing toward the makeshift cradle where the baby still slept. "How did he do overnight?" "He ate twice, slept between feedings. He seems strong." Martha's voice was steady, but her hands were clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from trembling. "Doctor?" Pemberton nodded slowly. "Mrs. Zimmerman, I need to speak with you about a delicate matter. Quincy Xavier came to see me this morning." Martha's throat tightened. "He wants his son." "Of course. I'll get the baby ready." "No," the doctor said, holding up a hand. "That's not... The situation is more complicated than that." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Quincy is devastated by Sarah's death. He's not thinking clearly. He told me this morning that he can't take care of an infant. He said he wants to find a family to adopt the boy." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. Adopt, but he's the father. A father who works from sunup to sundown on a cattle ranch. A father with no wife, no home of his own, no way to care for an infant. He's being practical, even if it's breaking his heart. Martha turned away, unable to look at the doctor, unable to process what she was hearing. "What families are you considering?" "That's why I'm here, doctor," Pemberton said quietly. "Quincy asked me to find a good home for his son, and I wondered. Mrs. Zimmerman, you've been alone since Thomas passed. You clearly have a gift with the child. Would you consider taking him?" The room seemed to tilt. Martha gripped the edge of her table to steady herself. "Me? But I'm alone. I'm barely making ends meet with sewing work. You're a widow, in good standing with the community. You have a home. You clearly know how to care for the boy." The doctor hesitated. "And forgive me for being blunt, but you have no children of your own. This might be your only opportunity." The cruelty of the statement, even delivered with good intentions, made Martha flinch. But it was true. This was her only opportunity, the only chance she would ever have to be a mother. "What about the father?" she asked. "If I took the baby, would Quincy want to be involved?" "I don't know, doctor," Pemberton admitted. "He's barely holding himself together right now. I think he needs time to grieve, to figure out his life. But legally, he would have to sign papers giving up his parental rights." Martha walked to the drawer where the baby slept and looked down at him. In the morning light, she could see he had his mother's delicate features and his father's strong jaw. He was beautiful, perfect, and completely helpless. "I can't afford to support a child," she whispered. "The ranch might be willing to help," Dr. Pemberton suggested. "Or the church. People help widows with children all the time, Mrs. Zimmerman. You wouldn't be alone in this." But she would be alone, Martha thought. Raising a child was supposed to be something shared between husband and wife. How could she do it by herself? How could she feed him, clothe him, give him everything he would need? And yet, how could she not try? "I need to speak with Mr. Xavier," she said finally. "If he's giving up his son, I need to hear it from him directly." Dr. Pemberton looked relieved. "I'll send him to you. He's staying at the boarding house until after Sarah's funeral tomorrow." After the doctor left, Martha stood in her quiet house and tried to understand how her life had turned upside down in the span of 12 hours. Yesterday she'd been a lonely widow with no purpose. Today she might become a mother. The impossibility of it made her head spin. She fed the baby again, changed him again, marveled at how natural these actions were starting to feel. She'd expected motherhood to be mysterious, but so much of it was simply practical necessity. The baby needed food and clean clothes and someone to hold him. She could provide those things. Whether she could provide everything else, all the intangible things a child needed, remained to be seen. Quincy Xavier arrived just before noon. Martha had seen him from a distance, but had never stood face to face with him before. Up close, his beauty was almost painful to look at. He was tall, with broad shoulders and lean muscle earned from hard ranch work. His dark hair needed cutting, falling past his collar in waves. His blue eyes were red-rimmed from crying, and his jaw was shadowed with stubble. But even grief-stricken and disheveled, he was striking. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he said, his voice rough, "thank you for taking care of my son." "He's a good baby," Martha replied, feeling awkward and inadequate. "I'm so sorry about your wife." Pain flashed across Quincy's face. "We weren't married yet. We were planning to wed next month after the baby came. She wanted to fit into her mother's wedding dress." He laughed, a hollow sound. "Stupid things we worry about." Martha didn't know what to say to that, so she stayed quiet. After a moment, Quincy cleared his throat. "Dr. Pemberton said you might be willing to take the boy, to raise him as your own." "If that's what you want," Martha said carefully. "But, Mr. Xavier, are you certain? He's your son. Grief might be clouding your judgment right now." Quincy's jaw tightened. "My judgment is perfectly clear. I'm a ranch hand. I live in a bunkhouse with 15 other men. I work 14-hour days. I have no family, no home, no way to care for an infant. What kind of life could I give him?" "But you're his father," Martha insisted. "That means something. It means I need to do what's best for him, not what's easiest for me." Quincy's voice cracked. "Do you think I want to give up my son? Do you think this isn't killing me? He's all I have left of Sarah. But loving him means giving him a chance at a real life, with a real home and a real mother." Martha's eyes stung with tears. "I can't replace his mother. No one can. But you can give him what I can't." Quincy took a shaky breath. "Can I see him?" Martha led him to the cradle. The baby was awake, his blue eyes staring up at nothing in particular. When Quincy leaned over him, the baby's gaze seemed to focus, as if recognizing something familiar in his father's face. Quincy reached down with a trembling hand and touched his son's cheek. The baby turned toward the touch, his mouth opening in instinctive seeking. A sob escaped Quincy's throat. "He looks like her," he whispered. "He has her nose." "He has your eyes," Martha said softly. They stood together over the cradle, two people united by circumstances neither had chosen. Finally, Quincy straightened. "If you take him, will you tell him about his mother? About Sarah?" "Of course. She was funny, she laughed at everything. She loved yellow roses and hated coffee, but drank it anyway because she thought it made her seem sophisticated." Quincy smiled through his tears. "She sang off key and she cried during church sermons, and she was the best thing that ever happened to me." "I'll tell him," Martha promised, "and I'll make sure he knows his father loved him enough to give him a better life." Quincy nodded, unable to speak. He bent and pressed a kiss to his son's forehead, then turned and walked out of the house without another word. Martha watched him go, her heart breaking for him, for the baby, for all of them caught in this tragedy. She returned to the cradle and picked up the baby, holding him close. "You're mine now," she whispered. "I don't know how we're going to manage, but you're mine." The next 3 days passed in a blur of paperwork and arrangements. Quincy signed documents giving up his parental rights. Martha signed documents accepting responsibility for the child. The whole process felt cold and bureaucratic, nothing like the momentous decision it represented. Sarah was buried in the North Platte Cemetery next to Martha's husband, their graves separated by a small fence, but united in their tragedy. Martha didn't attend Sarah's funeral. It felt wrong somehow, like she would be intruding on grief that wasn't hers. But she watched from her window as the procession passed, saw Quincy walking behind the coffin with his head bowed and his shoulders slumped in defeat. She named the baby James, after her own father, who had died when she was young, James Thomas Zimmerman, giving him her late husband's name as a middle name. It felt right, connecting this new life to the one she'd lost. The baby didn't care what he was called. He only cared that he was fed and warm and held, simple needs that Martha found herself capable of meeting, despite all her doubts. Mrs. Patterson stopped by regularly with advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Other women from the church brought casseroles and offered help. Martha was surprised by the support, having expected judgment instead. but apparently a widow raising an orphaned baby was more acceptable than a widow living alone with no purpose. Her status in the community had shifted overnight from pitiable to respectable. 2 weeks after Sarah's death, Martha was sitting on her porch at dusk with James sleeping in her arms when Quincy Xavier appeared at her gate. She hadn't seen him since the day he'd given up his son, and the sight of him made her heart skip with anxiety. "Mr. Xavier," she said cautiously. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, not coming any closer. "I just wanted to see how he's doing." Martha relaxed slightly. "He's well, gaining weight. He likes to be held. Can I—" Quincy gestured hesitantly. "Can I come closer?" Martha nodded, and Quincy walked up the porch steps. He stood a respectful distance away, looking down at the sleeping baby. "He's grown already. Babies do that quickly, apparently." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Quincy said, "I need to apologize. I walked away without thinking about you. You're alone, you just lost your husband, and I saddled you with a baby and responsibility you didn't ask for." "I chose this," Martha said firmly. "You didn't force anything on me. Still, it's not fair to you." Quincy's expression was troubled. "I've been thinking about it, and I want to help. Financially, I mean. I can give you part of my wages every month for the baby's needs." Pride made Martha want to refuse, but practicality won out. "That would be helpful, thank you. And I was wondering—" Quincy hesitated, turning his hat in his hands. "Could I visit sometimes? I know I gave up my rights. I know he's yours now, but I'd like to see him, to know he's doing well." Martha's first instinct was to say no. Having Quincy appear periodically would complicate everything, would make it harder to think of James as truly hers. But looking at the raw hope in his eyes, she found she couldn't refuse him. "You can visit," she agreed. "But Mr. Xavier, you need to understand that I'm his mother now. Not legally, not by blood, but in every way that matters. I won't have him confused about that." "I understand. Thank you, Mrs. Zimmerman." Quincy looked at the baby one more time, then turned to leave. At the gate, he paused. "Sarah would have liked you. She always said you had kind eyes." He was gone before Martha could respond. She sat in the gathering darkness, rocking James, trying to process this new complication. Quincy Xavier wanting to be part of his son's life changed things in ways she hadn't anticipated. It meant she wouldn't be alone in raising James, but it also meant the child would grow up knowing his real father, which could make Martha's position precarious. She pushed the worries aside. Tomorrow's problems could wait for tomorrow. Tonight, she had a baby in her arms, and a purpose she'd never thought she'd have. It was enough. Quincy came back 3 days later, then again a week after that. His visits fell into a pattern. He would arrive in the evening after his work at the ranch was done. He'd sit on the porch with Martha, holding James with a combination of terror and wonder, talking about his day or the weather or anything except the grief that still shadowed his eyes. Martha found herself looking forward to these visits more than she wanted to admit. There was something comforting about Quincy's presence. He didn't demand anything from her, didn't judge her fumbling attempts at motherhood. He just sat and held his son and seemed grateful for the opportunity. And gradually, carefully, they began to talk about more than just the baby. Martha learned that Quincy was 26 years old, that he'd come to Nebraska from Missouri after his parents died in a fire. He'd been working ranches since he was 16, following the cattle and the work wherever it led him. He'd met Sarah at a church social and had fallen for her immediately, drawn to her laughter and her optimism. They'd been courting for only 6 months when she got pregnant, which had scandalized the town, but hadn't diminished Quincy's determination to marry her. In turn, Martha told him about her own past, about growing up in St. Louis, about the illness that had stolen her chance at children, about marrying Thomas because he was kind and because no other man would have her after learning of her condition. She didn't know why she was telling Quincy these things, revealing secrets she'd kept hidden from everyone else in North Platte. Maybe it was because he'd already seen her at her most vulnerable, caring for the baby she wasn't supposed to be able to have. Or maybe it was simply that talking to him felt natural in a way, talking to her late husband never had. Summer deepened into July, and the heat became oppressive. Martha's small house turned into an oven during the day, making James fussy and uncomfortable. She took to sitting under the large cottonwood tree in her yard during the hottest hours, the baby sleeping in a basket beside her while she sewed. Quincy started timing his visits to the evening when the temperature finally dropped to something bearable. One evening, he arrived to find Martha struggling to hang laundry on her clothesline while simultaneously trying to keep James from crying. The baby was going through a fussy phase, wanting to be held constantly, and Martha was exhausted from trying to manage both him and the endless household tasks that needed doing. "Here," Quincy said, setting down the bag of supplies he had brought. "Let me take him." He scooped James up with practiced ease. In the weeks of visiting, he had become comfortable handling his son, no longer afraid he might break him. James quieted immediately, recognizing his father's hold. Martha watched them for a moment, something twisting in her chest at the sight of Quincy murmuring nonsense words to the baby before returning to her laundry. "You look tired," Quincy observed. "I am tired. He was up 5 times last night." Martha pinned a sheet to the line with more force than necessary. "I don't know how women with multiple children manage. You're doing this alone. That's different." "So are you," Martha pointed out. "You work all day and then come here." "That's different too. I get to leave." Quincy's expression turned guilty. "I get to hand him back and go sleep in a quiet bunkhouse. You're with him every moment." Martha wanted to argue, to say she didn't resent the responsibility, but she was too exhausted to lie. "I love him," she said instead, "but some days I don't know if I'm doing anything right." "You're keeping him alive and healthy and happy. That seems pretty right to me." They worked together in companionable silence, Martha hanging laundry while Quincy walked the yard with James. By the time the last sheet was pinned, the baby was sound asleep on his father's shoulder. Quincy carried him inside and laid him carefully in the cradle that Martha had purchased with money from the church charity fund. "Thank you," Martha said quietly, "for helping." "I should be helping more. This isn't fair to you." "Life isn't fair to anyone," Martha replied. "We just do the best we can." Quincy looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he nodded and left, and Martha stood in her doorway watching him walk down the dusty street, wondering why his departure always left her feeling more alone than she had before he arrived. August brought a new complication. Mrs. Walsh, the banker's wife and unofficial head of North Platte's social hierarchy, paid Martha a visit. She swept into the small house with her usual air of superiority, her gaze taking in every detail with sharp assessment. "Mrs. Zimmerman," she said without preamble, "I've come to discuss your situation." Martha, who had been feeding James, felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "What situation would that be, Mrs. Walsh?" "Don't be coy. The whole town is talking about Quincy Xavier's frequent visits. It's not proper for a single man to be visiting a widow so regularly, particularly not in the evening." Heat flooded Martha's face. "Mr. Xavier is visiting his son. There's nothing improper about it. Legally, that child is not his son anymore. You adopted him. And regardless of the reason for Mr. Xavier's visits, the appearance is what matters. People are starting to talk, and it reflects badly on you." Martha's grip on the baby bottle tightened. "I don't care what people say." "Perhaps you should. You're dependent on the charity and goodwill of this community. If people start to question your morals, that support could disappear very quickly." "Mrs." Walsh's expression softened slightly, as close to kind as she ever got. "I'm not trying to be cruel, my dear. I'm trying to protect you. Either Mr. Xavier needs to stop visiting, or the two of you need to regularize your situation." "Regularize?" Martha's voice came out sharp. "You mean marry? That's absurd. We barely know each other." "You know each other well enough to be raising a child together, apparently, and marriage would solve all the problems. You'd have a husband to support you, the child would have both parents, and the gossips would have nothing to complain about." After Mrs. Walsh left, Martha sat with James and tried to process the conversation. Marriage to Quincy Xavier hadn't even occurred to her as a possibility. He was still mourning Sarah. She was still adjusting to her new identity as a mother. The idea of adding a marriage into that complicated mix seemed insane. But Mrs. Walsh's words had planted a seed of worry. What if the town did withdraw its support? What if her reputation was damaged beyond repair? She couldn't afford to lose the sewing work that kept a roof over their heads and food on the table. When Quincy arrived that evening, Martha met him at the gate instead of inviting him to the porch. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. His expression immediately turned wary. "What's wrong?" "Mrs. Walsh came to see me today. Apparently people are talking about your visits, about us." Quincy's jaw tightened. "Let them talk." "It's not that simple. My reputation affects James. If they question my morals, it could affect how they treat him. Then I'll stop visiting, Quincy said immediately, though the words clearly cost him. I won't put either of you at risk. Martha had expected this response, had even thought it might be the best solution. But hearing him say it made her realize how much she'd come to depend on his visits, how much she looked forward to having another adult to talk to, someone who understood the peculiar situation they were in. Mrs. Walsh suggested an alternative, she said slowly. She suggested we should get married. The silence that followed was deafening. Quincy stared at her with an expression somewhere between shock and horror. Married? It would solve the problem. We're already raising James together. Marriage would just make it official. Martha rushed on before she could lose her nerve. It wouldn't have to be a real marriage. We could maintain separate lives, separate sleeping arrangements. It would just be for appearances, to protect both of us. Quincy turned away, his hand coming up to grip the back of his neck. I can't marry you. The rejection stung more than Martha had anticipated. Why not? Because Sarah's only been dead for 2 months. Because I'm not ready. Because marrying you for convenience would be a disservice to both of us. He turned back, his expression anguished. I care about you, Martha. You've given my son a home and a mother, and you've been kinder to me than I deserve, but I can't marry you. Not like this. Martha nodded stiffly, humiliation burning through her. I understand. Then I think Mrs. Walsh is right. You should stop visiting. Martha, no, please don't do this. What choice do we have? Her voice broke despite her best efforts to stay composed. If your visits continue, my reputation will be destroyed. James will suffer for it. We have to think about what's best for him. Quincy looked like she'd struck him, but he nodded slowly. You're right. I'm sorry. For all of it. He walked away into the gathering dusk, and Martha went inside to cry over the baby's cradle, while James slept peacefully, unaware that his small world had just fractured. The next week was the longest of Martha's life. She missed Quincy's visits desperately, missed having someone to share the burden of caring for James, missed their conversations and his quiet company. The house felt emptier than it had even in the weeks after Thomas's death. At least then she'd had no idea what she was missing. Now she knew exactly what loneliness felt like. James seemed to sense his father's absence. He became fussier, harder to soothe, as if he could feel the hole where Quincy used to be. Martha walked the floor with him at all hours, singing lullabies in a voice rusty from disuse, trying to be enough for this child who deserved so much more than one exhausted widow could provide. On the 8th day, she was sitting on her porch at dusk, James finally sleeping after hours of fussing, when Quincy appeared at her gate. Her heart leaped and plummeted simultaneously. What are you doing here? I've been miserable, he said bluntly. This past week has been hell. I can't eat, can't sleep, can't focus on work. I'm useless. That's not my problem, Martha said, but her voice lacked conviction. Yes, it is, because I'm not miserable just because I miss my son. I'm miserable because I miss you. Quincy opened the gate and walked up to the porch. I've been thinking about what you said, about marriage. Martha's breath caught. Quincy, you don't have to do this. I understand. You don't understand. I don't want to marry you just to solve a problem or protect reputations. He knelt in front of her chair, taking her free hand in both of his. I want to marry you because these past 2 months, you've become one of the most important people in my life. Because when I think about the future, I see you in it. Because James deserves both of us, together, as a real family. But Sarah, Martha whispered, you loved her. I did love her. I'll always love her. But she's gone, and I'm still here, and so are you. His blue eyes were intense, pleading. I know it's fast. I know it's complicated. But nothing about our situation has been conventional from the start. Why should this be different? Martha's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This isn't just convenience talking. You actually want this? I want this more than I've wanted anything in a long time. Quincy's grip on her hand tightened. I'm not asking you to replace Sarah. I'm asking you to build something new with me, something that's ours. She looked down at James sleeping in her arms, then back at Quincy. The decision should have been difficult, should have required careful thought and consideration. But the truth was, she'd already made it somewhere in the past week during all those lonely hours missing him. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. The smile that broke across Quincy's face was the first genuine happiness she'd seen from him since Sarah's death. He leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead, careful not to disturb the baby between them. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin. "I'll make you happy, I promise." They were married 2 weeks later in a quiet ceremony at the church with only Dr. Pemberton and Mrs. Patterson as witnesses. Martha wore her Sunday dress, and Quincy wore his one good suit. James slept through the entire proceeding, blissfully unaware he was about to gain a father. Reverend Price kept the ceremony brief, either out of consideration for the baby or disapproval at the hasty marriage. Martha suspected the latter, but she didn't care. As she stood next to Quincy and repeated the vows that would bind them together, she felt something shift in her heart. This wasn't the marriage she'd had with Thomas, born of practicality and low expectations. This was something that felt dangerous and full of potential, like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump. After the ceremony, Quincy moved his few belongings into Martha's house. It was strange having a man in her space again, but Quincy was considerate of her privacy. He took over the small storage room off the kitchen, insisting Martha keep the bedroom for herself and James. He worked during the day at the ranch and came home in the evenings to help with the baby and whatever other tasks needed doing. They fell into a routine that was surprisingly comfortable. Quincy would arrive home dusty and tired, wash up at the pump outside, and then take James while Martha prepared dinner. They'd eat together, talking about their days, and then share the evening tasks of caring for the baby. Quincy proved to be surprisingly domestic, unafraid of dirty diapers or late-night feedings. He took over the heavy chores, the hauling water and chopping wood, giving Martha a respite she hadn't realized she needed. At night, they retreated to their separate rooms, maintaining the boundaries they had agreed upon. The marriage was real in all the practical ways, but remained unconsummated, a partnership rather than a romance. Martha told herself she was content with the arrangement. She had a husband, a child, security. What more could she want? But as summer faded into autumn, she found herself increasingly aware of Quincy in ways that had nothing to do with practical partnership. The way his shirt stretched across his shoulders when he worked in the yard. The sound of his laugh when James did something amusing. The gentleness in his hands when he held their son. She started thinking of James as their son, not just hers, and the shift in her thinking felt significant in ways she couldn't quite name. One evening in late September, they were sitting on the porch after putting James to bed, enjoying the cool air that finally hinted at the coming winter. Quincy had been quiet all evening, and Martha finally asked what was bothering him. "I've been thinking about the sleeping arrangements," he said, without looking at her. "Not because I'm unhappy with them, but because people are going to start wondering. We've been married for over a month. If we keep separate rooms, gossip will start again." Martha's stomach fluttered. "Are you suggesting we share a room?" "I'm suggesting we act like a real married couple." Quincy finally met her eyes. "Not because of obligation, because I want to. If you're not ready, I understand. But Martha, I need you to know that this hasn't been a pretend marriage for me, not for a while now." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I've fallen in love with you." The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for too long. "I didn't mean to. I didn't think I could, not so soon after Sarah, but you've changed everything. You're strong and kind and so damn beautiful, it makes my chest hurt sometimes. And I want this to be a real marriage in every way. If you'll have me." Martha couldn't breathe. She'd been so careful to guard her heart, to not hope for more than the practical arrangement they had agreed to. But hearing Quincy say he loved her broke through all her defenses. "I was told I couldn't have children," she blurted out. "The doctor said I was damaged. That's why Thomas married me, knowing he'd never have his own children. If we consummate this marriage, you need to know that James might be the only child we ever have." Quincy crossed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands. "Martha, you are not damaged, and I don't care if we have 10 more children or none at all. James is ours, and that's enough. You are enough." "I love you too," she whispered, finally admitting the truth she'd been hiding from herself. "I've been so afraid to feel this, to want this." "Don't be afraid." Quincy leaned down and kissed her, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as she responded. It was everything her perfunctory kisses with Thomas had never been, filled with genuine desire and emotion. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quincy rested his forehead against hers. "Come to bed with me. Let me show you how much I love you." They moved inside, checking on James one more time to find him sleeping soundly in his cradle. Then Quincy led Martha to the bedroom, and for the first time since their marriage, they truly became husband and wife. He was gentle and patient, attentive to her needs in ways she'd never experienced. Thomas had been awkward and quick, seemingly embarrassed by the whole process. Quincy made her feel desired and cherished, taking his time, making sure she felt pleasure as well as giving it. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, Martha felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. She had a husband who loved her, a son who needed her, a life that felt full of purpose and meaning. The fact that all of it had come from tragedy didn't diminish the goodness of what they'd built together. "What are you thinking?" Quincy murmured against her hair. "That I'm happy, that I thought I'd never have this." "Neither did I. After Sarah died, I thought I'd never feel anything again except grief. But you brought me back to life." They fell asleep tangled together, and when James woke crying at 2 a.m, they both got up to care for him, working together in the lamplight, a family in every sense of the word. Winter came to North Platte with brutal winds and heavy snow. The ranch work slowed during the coldest months, which meant Quincy was home more often. They used the time to strengthen their small family, establishing traditions and routines that would carry them through the years ahead. Quincy taught Martha to play poker with matchsticks as betting chips. She taught him the songs her mother had sung to her as a child. They took turns reading to James from the Bible, even though he was far too young to understand, just because it felt like something parents should do. Christmas was a sparse affair, but joyful nonetheless. Quincy carved a set of wooden blocks for James. Martha made new curtains for the house and a shirt for her husband. They attended Christmas service at the church, standing together as a family, and Martha felt the weight of the town's approval for the first time. The marriage had legitimized her position and quieted the gossips. She and Quincy were now seen as a respectable couple making the best of difficult circumstances. On Christmas night, after James was asleep, they made love by the fire and talked about the future. Quincy wanted to save enough money to buy land of their own, maybe start a small ranch. Martha wanted to expand her sewing business, maybe even open a small dress shop. They were dreams that felt attainable, built on the foundation of what they had already accomplished together. "I never thought I'd have this," Martha said, echoing her words from months before. "A husband who loves me, a child, hope for the future." "You thought you'd never hold a baby," Quincy said softly, his hand gentle on her hair. "But look at us now. We have a son. We have each other. We have everything." January brought a cold snap that kept them housebound for days. Martha was grateful for Quincy's presence, for his help managing the endless tasks of keeping the house warm and the baby comfortable. James was 6 months old now, growing more alert and interactive every day. He smiled at the sound of his father's voice and reached for his mother when she came into view. He was their son in every way that mattered. One snowy evening, Martha was kneading bread dough when Quincy came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "I have news," he said. She turned in his embrace, her hands still covered in flour. "Good news, I hope. The ranch is promoting me to foreman. It means better pay and a house on the ranch property. A real house, Martha, with 3 bedrooms and a parlor, and a kitchen twice the size of this one." Martha's heart leaped. "That's wonderful. There's one condition." Quincy's expression turned serious. "The ranch wants family men as foremen. They want people who are stable, who have ties to the community." When I told them about James, about how we're raising him, the owner was impressed. He said a man who'd take responsibility for his son like that was the kind of man he wanted working for him. "When would we move?" "Not until spring, but I wanted to tell you now, so you'd have time to prepare." Quincy kissed her flour-dusted nose. "We're moving up in the world. Mrs. Xavier, our son is going to grow up in a real house with a real yard, maybe even have brothers and sisters to play with." Martha stiffened slightly. "Quincy, I told you, I can't have children. You don't know that for certain. That doctor who told your mother you were damaged, did he actually examine you, or was he just guessing based on your illness?" Martha thought back. "I don't remember. I was so young. So maybe he was wrong. Maybe the reason you didn't conceive with Thomas had nothing to do with you." Quincy cupped her face. "I'm not trying to give you false hope, but I'm also not willing to accept that diagnosis without question. We have James, and if that's all we ever have, I'm grateful." But if there's even a chance, I want to try. That night, as they lay in bed, Martha allowed herself to hope for something she'd given up on years ago. Maybe the doctor had been wrong. Maybe she wasn't damaged. Maybe their family could grow beyond the three of them. The possibility was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. February came and went, bringing Valentine's Day, which Quincy celebrated by presenting Martha with a carved wooden heart he'd made in secret. She gave him a kiss that led to more, and they spent the afternoon in bed while James napped, rediscovering each other in the gray winter light. March brought the first hints of spring and an unexpected visitor. Dr. Pemberton stopped by on a Sunday afternoon, his expression serious. Martha invited him in, her mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. Had there been a problem with the adoption papers? Was someone challenging her right to raise James? "I'll get straight to the point," the doctor said, accepting coffee but not sitting down. "Martha, when was your last monthly?" She blinked, startled by the personal question. "I don't see how that's relevant." "Humor me. When?" Martha thought back. With the stress of marriage and caring for James, she hadn't been paying close attention to her cycle. "I'm not sure. December, maybe? Or early January?" "That's what I thought. Martha, I think you might be pregnant." The room tilted. Quincy, who had been standing by the fireplace, moved quickly to take her elbow. "That's not possible," Martha said weakly. "I noticed last Sunday at church that you looked fuller in the face, and Mrs. Patterson mentioned you'd been feeling poorly in the mornings lately. Those are classic signs. Have you been tired? Emotional? Have your breasts been tender?" Martha's mind raced back over the past weeks. She had been exhausted, but she'd attributed it to caring for James. She had been weepy at odd moments, but she'd thought it was just happiness at her new life. And yes, her body had felt different, but she hadn't allowed herself to examine why. "I can't be pregnant," she repeated. "The doctor said I was barren." Doctors can be wrong, and whatever damage that childhood illness might have caused, it clearly wasn't permanent. Dr. Pemberton smiled. "I'd like to examine you properly to confirm, but, Martha, I think you're about 2 months along, maybe 3. The tears came then, unstoppable. Quincy pulled her into his arms while she sobbed against his chest, overwhelmed by joy and disbelief and terror. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I don't know why I'm crying." "Because it's a miracle," Quincy said, his own voice thick with emotion. "We're having a baby, our baby." The examination confirmed Dr. Pemberton's suspicions. Martha was indeed pregnant, probably due in late September or early October. The doctor cautioned that given her history, she should be careful and rest as much as possible. But he saw no reason why she couldn't carry the baby to term and deliver safely. After he left, Martha and Quincy sat together on the sofa with James between them, trying to process the news. "I thought it would only ever be him," Martha said, stroking James's soft hair. "I thought he would be my only chance at motherhood. And now he'll be a big brother," Quincy said. "He'll help us take care of the new baby." "Are you happy? Truly?" "Martha, I'm so happy I can barely think straight." Quincy leaned over James to kiss her. "You've given me everything. A son, a home, a real family, and now this. How could I be anything but grateful?" The move to the ranch happened in April, just as Martha was starting to show. The new house was everything Quincy had promised and more. It had real glass windows and a wood stove that heated efficiently. The bedrooms were spacious, and there was even a small room off the kitchen that could serve as a nursery. James would have his own room for the first time, though they decided to wait until he was a bit older before transitioning him out of their bedroom. Martha nested with a fervor that surprised her. She sewed curtains and made quilts and prepared the nursery with a single-minded determination that Quincy found both amusing and touching. Her body was changing in ways that fascinated and sometimes frightened her. The baby moved inside her, small flutters at first that grew into definite kicks and rolls. She would press Quincy's hand to her belly so he could feel their child moving, and the wonder on his face made her fall in love with him all over again. James, now 9 months old, was oblivious to the coming changes. He was crawling everywhere, getting into everything, keeping Martha constantly on her toes. But she loved every exhausting moment. This was what she'd dreamed of, what she'd thought she'd never have. A house full of children, chaos and noise and love in equal measure. Summer brought scorching heat again, made worse by Martha's pregnancy. She grew large and uncomfortable, her ankles swelling and her back aching. Quincy took over as much of the child care as he could, playing with James in the evenings and getting up with him at night so Martha could rest. The other ranch wives checked on her regularly, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Martha felt embraced by a community in a way she never had in town. August brought false alarms. Twice Martha thought she was going into labor, only to have the pains fade after a few hours. Dr. Pemberton, who had agreed to attend the birth, cautioned her to rest and stay cool. The baby would come when ready, he assured her, and there was no rushing nature. On September 15th, Martha woke at dawn with a familiar pain in her lower back. She lay still for a moment, waiting to see if it would fade like the false alarms. But this time, the pain grew stronger, radiating around to her belly. She gripped Quincy's shoulder, waking him. "It's time." He was out of bed instantly, pulling on clothes and running to fetch Dr. Pemberton. Mrs. Patterson arrived to take care of James, whisking the confused toddler away, while Martha paced the bedroom, timing contractions that grew closer and more intense with each passing hour. Labor was longer and harder than she'd anticipated. Dr. Pemberton remained calm and encouraging, but Martha could see the concern in his eyes as the hours stretched on. Quincy held her hand through every contraction, letting her squeeze hard enough to leave bruises, murmuring encouragement and love. Finally, as the sun was setting and Martha was certain she couldn't take another moment, Dr. Pemberton announced it was time to push. She bore down with everything she had, feeling like she was being torn apart, certain something must be going wrong. But Quincy was there, his face close to hers, telling her she was strong, she could do this, just a little more. And then suddenly, there was release, and a baby's cry filled the room. "A girl," Dr. Pemberton announced, holding up a tiny, squalling infant. "You have a daughter." Martha collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face. Quincy was crying too, laughing and crying at the same time as the doctor cleaned and swaddled their daughter. When he finally placed the baby in Martha's arms, she looked down at the tiny face and felt her heart expand impossibly larger. "She's perfect," she whispered. "She's beautiful, just like her mother," Quincy said, sitting on the edge of the bed and wrapping his arms around both of them. "What should we name her?" "Sarah," Martha said without hesitation. "After the mother, she'll never know. The woman who gave us James." Quincy's face crumpled, and he buried his face in Martha's hair, his shoulders shaking. It was the grief he'd been holding back for over a year, finally released in this moment of joy. When he could speak again, his voice was rough. "Sarah would have loved that. Thank you." They sat together with their daughter between them, marveling at her tiny fingers and perfect features. When James was brought back later that evening, he stared at his baby sister with wide, curious eyes. Quincy lifted him onto the bed, careful of Martha, and let the toddler touch Sarah's hand gently. "This is your sister," Martha told him. "You're going to help us take care of her." James didn't understand, but he seemed to sense the importance of the moment. He leaned down and kissed Sarah's forehead with exaggerated care, making both parents laugh through their tears. Over the next weeks, they adjusted to life with 2 children. Sarah was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in stretches long enough to keep Martha from complete exhaustion. James was fascinated by his sister, wanting to help with everything. Quincy took a week off work to be home, cooking meals and managing James while Martha recovered. One evening, about a month after Sarah's birth, Martha was nursing the baby while Quincy played blocks with James. She watched her family, her heart so full it ached. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night, when you placed James in my arms?" Quincy looked up from the block tower James was destroying. "I don't think I said anything. I was barely holding myself together." "Not you, Dr. Pemberton. He said I was taking the baby just for the night, that you would make decisions about his future. But I knew, even then, that he was mine to keep. I just didn't know how much more I'd gain along with him. He brought us together," Quincy said. "Without James, we never would have met. We never would have fallen in love." "I thought I'd never hold a baby," Martha said softly. "I thought that part of life was closed to me. And then you placed your son in my arms, and everything changed." Quincy came to sit beside her on the sofa, careful not to jostle Sarah. "You changed my life too. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave James a mother and me a reason to keep living. You're the strongest person I know, Martha Xavier." They sat together as darkness fell outside, their small family complete and content. James eventually fell asleep on the floor, surrounded by blocks. Sarah finished nursing and drifted off with milk on her lips. Martha and Quincy remained on the sofa, holding hands, watching their children and counting their blessings. The years that followed were full and busy. James grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved helping his father on the ranch. Sarah turned out to have her namesake's sunny disposition, laughing at everything and everyone. When James was 4 and Sarah 2, Martha became pregnant again, delivering a healthy boy they named Thomas after Martha's late husband. 2 years later came another daughter, Rose, completing their family. The house that had once seemed so spacious was now filled with noise and chaos and love. Quincy thrived as foreman, eventually buying a piece of land and starting his own small ranch operation. Martha opened a dress shop in North Platte, hiring other women to help with the sewing while she managed the business and raised their children. They faced challenges, of course: drought years when money was tight, illness that swept through the family, the normal struggles of raising children and managing a household and building a life together. But they faced everything as a team, their love deepening with each passing year. On their 10th anniversary, Quincy took Martha on a picnic to the spot where Sarah was buried. They brought flowers and sat together in the sunshine, their children playing nearby. "Do you think she knows?" Martha asked. "About us? About how we ended up?" "I think she'd be happy," Quincy said. "She loved James. She'd want him to grow up in a loving home with siblings and 2 parents who adore him." "I talk to Sarah sometimes," Martha admitted. "Our Sarah, I mean. When she asks about her name, I tell her about the brave, funny woman she's named after, about how that woman gave us the greatest gift." James asks about his birth mother, too. I tell him the truth, that she loved him so much she grew him in her body, but that she had to leave before she could meet him, that his mama now loves him just as fiercely. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children. James was tall for 10 years old, with his father's dark hair and his birth mother's delicate features. Sarah was 7, all blonde curls and infectious laughter. Thomas was 5, serious and thoughtful. Rose was 3, fearless and mischievous. They were a mismatched set, bound together by love rather than blood. Proof that family was what you made it. "I never imagined this life," Martha said. "When Thomas died, when I was alone and desperate, I couldn't see past my grief. I thought my life was over." "It was just beginning," Quincy said. "We both were. We just didn't know it yet." As the sun began to set over the Nebraska prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they gathered their children and headed home. The ranch house rose in the distance, smoke curling from the chimney, lights glowing in the windows. It was a place of warmth and love, built on the foundation of tragedy, transformed into hope. That night, after the children were finally asleep, Martha and Quincy sat on their front porch and watched the stars emerge. It was their favorite time, these quiet moments after the chaos of the day had settled. Quincy's arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Do you ever regret it?" Martha asked. "Taking me on with all my complications? You could have had an easier life." "Easier doesn't mean better. You and our children are everything I never knew I needed." Quincy kissed the top of her head. "Besides, you took me on with my baggage too. A grief-stricken cowboy with a newborn son and no prospects. We were both taking a gamble." "Best gamble I ever made," Martha said. "Mine too." They sat in peaceful silence, content in their love and their life together. Inside the house, their children slept safe and warm. The ranch was prospering, their future stretched ahead full of possibility. It was a life neither had dared to dream of in those dark days after their separate tragedies. But together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of loss. Martha thought back to that first night, holding James in her arms and feeling the weight of new life, the crushing responsibility, and the overwhelming love. She'd thought he would be her only chance at motherhood, her single glimpse of what might have been. Instead, he'd been the beginning of everything, the bridge that carried her from despair to joy, from loneliness to belonging. Quincy had placed their son in her arms and unknowingly given her a future she'd stopped believing in, and in return, she'd given him a reason to live, a way forward through his grief, a family to come home to. They'd saved each other in the most unexpected way, 2 broken people becoming whole together. James turned 11 that fall, old enough now to understand his unique story. On his birthday, they sat him down and told him everything, about Sarah, about the tragedy of his birth, about the choice his father had made to give him a chance at a better life. They told him about Martha's inability to have children and the miracle of his arrival, how he'd changed everything for both of them. He listened quietly, his young face serious, processing information that would have overwhelmed many children. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "So I have two mothers, one who grew me and one who raised me?" "Yes," Martha said, her throat tight. "That's good," James decided. "That means twice as much love went into making me who I am." Martha pulled him into her arms. This boy who had made her a mother, who had brought her husband into her life, who had given her a purpose when she'd lost all hope. "You are so loved," she whispered. "By all of us, always." That Christmas was particularly special. The house was decorated with pine boughs and candles. The children performed a nativity play they'd rehearsed for weeks. Neighbors came for dinner, filling the house with laughter and conversation. As Martha served pie and watched her family gathered around the table, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. Late that night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, she found Quincy in the barn, checking on a mare due to foal. She wrapped her shawl tighter against the cold and went to join him. "You should be inside where it's warm," he said, but he pulled her close. "I wanted to tell you something. I've been thinking about it all day." Martha turned in his arms to face him. "I want you to know that you're the love of my life, Quincy Xavier. Not just my husband, not just my partner. You're the man I was meant to find, even if it took tragedy to bring us together." Quincy's eyes were bright in the lamplight. "I feel the same way. I loved Sarah, and I'll always be grateful for the time we had. But what we have, Martha, it's deeper than anything I've known. It's built on shared struggle and understanding. We've earned each other." They kissed in the warm barn, surrounded by the gentle sounds of sleeping animals, and Martha marveled again at the unpredictability of life. A year and a half ago, she'd been a widow without hope. Now she was a wife, a mother of 4, a businesswoman, a pillar of her community, all because a grieving cowboy had placed his newborn son in her arms and trusted her with the most precious thing he had. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but also joy and growth. James grew into a fine young man who worked the ranch alongside his father. Sarah became a teacher, beloved by her students. Thomas took over Martha's dress shop, showing an unexpected talent for business. Rose married young and gave Martha and Quincy their first grandchild. On their 20th anniversary, Quincy surprised Martha with a trip to St. Louis, back to the city where she'd grown up. They walked the streets of her childhood, visited the church where she'd been baptized, stood outside the house where she'd once lived. But it all felt like someone else's memories, a different life that barely connected to the woman she'd become. "Are you glad you left?" Quincy asked as they stood by the Mississippi River, watching boats pass. "I'm glad for everything that led me to you," Martha said. "Even the hard parts, even the losses. They made me who I needed to be to build our life together." They returned to Nebraska with renewed appreciation for what they had built. The ranch was thriving. Their children were healthy and happy. Their love had only grown stronger with time. At night, they still sat on their porch and watched the stars, counting their blessings and planning their future. When James married at 22, choosing a sweet girl from town who reminded everyone of his birth mother, Martha stood beside Quincy and watched their son begin his own family. When he and his wife welcomed their first child a year later, James brought the baby to meet his parents with tears in his eyes. "I understand now," he said, placing his daughter in Martha's arms. "I understand what you and Father did for me, the sacrifice and the love. I want to be the kind of father he's been, and I want my children to know the kind of mother you've been." Martha held her granddaughter and felt the circle complete. She'd thought she'd never hold a baby all those years ago. Now she held her son's daughter, a new generation carrying forward the legacy of love and family they'd built from tragedy. That evening, she and Quincy sat on their porch as always, but this time they had a new topic of conversation: grandparenthood and all the joys it would bring. They were in their 50s now, their hair graying, their bodies showing the wear of years of hard work, but their love remained as strong as ever, perhaps stronger for having been tested and proven true. "I think about that night sometimes," Quincy said, "the night Sarah died and James was born. how desperate and lost I was, how I couldn't see any way forward. I think about it too, Martha admitted. How empty my life felt, how certain I was that I'd never have the family I'd always wanted. And then Dr. Pemberton put James in your arms, and everything changed. You changed everything, Martha corrected. You trusted me with your son. You gave me a chance when I'd given up on chances. Quincy took her hand the same way he had thousands of times over their 21 years together. We gave each other a chance. That's what love is, isn't it? Taking a leap of faith and trusting someone to catch you. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Inside the house, they could hear their youngest daughter Rose laughing with her husband, could hear their grandchildren playing. The sounds of family, of life continuing forward, of love passed down through generations. Martha thought about the girl she'd been in St. Louis, sick and scared, and told she'd never have children. She thought about the young woman who'd married Thomas out of practicality, hoping for love but settling for companionship. She thought about the widow who'd lost her husband and her hope simultaneously. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she barely recognized. The woman she'd become was forged in fire and grief, but tempered by love. She was a mother, wife, grandmother, businesswoman, and friend. She was strong because she'd had to be, compassionate because she'd known suffering, grateful because she'd lost everything and gained it all back in unexpected ways. I'm happy, she said simply. Right now, in this moment, with you beside me and our family safe inside, I'm perfectly, completely happy. Quincy squeezed her hand. So am I. We made it, Martha. We built something beautiful. And they had. From the ashes of loss and the depth of despair, they'd built a family, a ranch, a life. They'd raised children who were kind and strong and ready to face whatever the world threw at them. They'd loved each other through good times and bad, had supported each other's dreams and comforted each other's sorrows. They'd proven that family wasn't always about blood, that love could bloom in the most unexpected circumstances, that endings could become beginnings if you were brave enough to take the chance. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Martha leaned her head on Quincy's shoulder and closed her eyes, content in the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She'd thought she'd never hold a baby, but the cowboy had placed their son in her arms, and in doing so, had given her the world. Everything else had followed from that single moment of trust and possibility, and she would be grateful for it every day for the rest of her life. The evening grew cooler, and eventually they went inside to join their family. The house was warm and bright, filled with conversation and laughter. Martha moved through the rooms, checking on her grandchildren, listening to Rose tell a story, accepting a cup of tea from Thomas. This was her legacy, not just the children she'd raised, but the love she'd nurtured, the home she'd built, the family she'd created from loss and determination. Later, in the privacy of their bedroom, Quincy held Martha close and whispered, I love you more today than I did yesterday, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today. That's impossible, Martha teased. You already love me perfectly. Then I'll love you impossibly, Quincy said, forever and beyond. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, secure in their love and their life. Outside, the Nebraska prairie stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars. Inside, a family born of tragedy and transformed by love slept peacefully, safe in the home that had been built on hope, faith, and the simple act of placing a baby in the arms of a woman who thought she'd never be a mother. It was a love story written in the harsh landscape of the Wild West, tempered by loss but strengthened by commitment. It was proof that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best ones, that love can grow in the most unlikely soil, and that family is what we make it, not what we're given. Martha and Quincy had made a family from grief and necessity, and they'd transformed it into something beautiful and lasting. Their story would be passed down through generations, how a cowboy and a widow found each other in the darkest moment of their lives, how they built a family from broken pieces, how love triumphed over loss. It would be told to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a testament to the power of hope and the resilience of the human heart. And it all began with a single, simple act. A cowboy placing his newborn son in the arms of a woman who thought she'd never hold a baby, and in doing so, giving both of them a future neither had dared to imagine. From that moment, Everything else had followed, a cascade of love and life that had transformed them both. Martha Xavier, once Martha Zimmerman, once a girl told she was damaged and broken, had become a matriarch, a pillar of her community, a woman who had taken tragedy and transformed it into triumph. And Quincy Xavier, once a grief-stricken cowboy with nothing but a newborn son and a heart full of pain, had become a successful rancher, a devoted father, and a man who loved his wife more with each passing year. Together, they had created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone, a family built on the foundations of love, trust, and the courage to take a chance on each other when they had every reason not to. It was a story of the Wild West, of hard times and harder choices, of survival and perseverance. But most of all, it was a love story, pure and simple, proof that even in the darkest moments, hope can bloom and love can flourish, and families can be born from the most unexpected circumstances. As Martha drifted off to sleep that night, held safe in her husband's arms, she sent up a silent prayer of thanks for the journey that had brought her here, for the cowboy who had placed their son in her arms and changed her life forever, and for every moment of joy and sorrow that had led her to this perfect, imperfect, beautiful life. She had everything she'd ever wanted, and more than she'd ever dreamed possible, all because she'd been brave enough to hold a baby, and compassionate enough to love a broken man, and strong enough to build a family from the ruins of their separate tragedies. And so, their story ended where it began, with a baby, with love, with hope for the future, and with two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. The Wild West had tried to break them, but instead it had forged them into something stronger, something that would endure for generations to come. They had loved and lost and loved again, and in the end, love had won. It always did.